Welcome to Voices of Adoptions, where we share the unique perspective, actionable advice, and meaningful stories of birth parents, adoptees, adoptive families, and other members of the adoption community. I'm Donna Pope, your host, and I'm so glad that you're here. Roderick, am I saying your name right?
Correct, Roderick Edwards.
Roderick Edwards. And we're excited to have him. He is a prolific author, actually written over 50 books. And so we'll talk a little bit about those, particularly his main book about adoption, which is entitled Together More, Rejection and Reunion. And so we're excited to hear his story behind that. But just in a little bit of a introduction, Roderick was left for dead at birth in the hospital. And I'm anxious to hear that story. He's, as an author, including the Roderick Edwards autobiography series. He was reunited with his biological family at the age of 50 and has written multiple books, 3 books on adoption, and is an adoption advocate. And so, Roderick, let's go ahead and start just by you telling about being left for dead at the hospital. And your adoption story. Tell us a little about that.
Well, I was a preemie, and I was born with some birth defects. So I think my mother was scared because without modern medicine, I might have not survived. I had several birth defects and had no name, and I think she just left me there. I have no ill will towards that, but that was just a reality that happened. And so I probably spent the first 4 years of my life either in the hospital or some kind of foster care, getting all patched up.
Mm-hmm. And so you never knew your mom at all?
No, not until the reunion, which we'll get to as we go along. I mean, I didn't even know her then because she was deceased, but I knew more about her, obviously as I learned about her.
Very good. So for the first 4 years of your life, you were either in the hospital or in foster care, and then you were adopted. Tell about that part.
Okay, well, so my first memory is, I guess my adoptive parents met me at a park. I guess they do this ahead of time to make sure that everything's right. And I do remember going down a slide, and I must have not ever gone down a slide because I was afraid, and I remember jumping off the side of it because I was afraid to go down it. So that's my very first memory. I don't know when most people have memories. That was my first. And then, obviously, I would do it.
No, and so go ahead. And so then you were adopted.
Then I was taken by the counselor to the house, and I remember, I say this in the book, by the way. I had a bunch of gum, and I chewed it all up. I was nervous. This is when you could still ride in the front seat as a child, and all the little foil wrappers were on the floor before I got there, and I was really upset because I was supposed to share that with my 2 new sisters, and I had eaten it all before I got there. I chewed it all up, so I thought that was kind of hilarious. That's my second memory that I ever had. So.
And so you had 2 sisters in your adoptive family, and then your mom and dad. How was your adoption?
It seemed to go all right. Like I said, I don't know what sparks our memory, whether sometimes it's traumatic and sometimes it's good. I think these are 2 good memories that I can tell. I got to the house, and there's the adoptive mother and father, and then the 2 sisters pop out from behind, and they were so excited. The first thing they say to me is, "We made cookies. Let's go eat it." So the first thing I add, that there's chocolate chip cookies, which end up being one of my favorite foods to this day. And then there's a gap. I don't know why, but there's a gap. I don't remember a lot of things until I'm like age 7 or so. And it's weird. And that's when they got divorced. So that's a traumatic experience, I guess, it causes that.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a 3-year, short time living in a family.
And so who did you go with when they got a divorce?
I stayed with the mother. The father eventually took both the older sisters, and by this time there were actually 2 more siblings by the mother, birthed by her. So I was the only adoptee in the house. So I had a younger brother and a younger sister as well in the house, which I helped raise because my adoptive mother was working a lot. So.
And so, do you remember your childhood as kind of a good, rough? Happy?
Well, there was some latent medical problems between the time they adopted me and the time about 8 or 9. actually thought I had some muscle deterioration. I spent a lot of time at Shriners Hospital, but I didn't have any of these things, and I'm fine today. But I remember those. But then, like I said, there was some reason I have this blockage of memory. I don't know why it is. I don't remember anything bad necessarily, and it picks up again probably about age 10 or 12 when I started visiting my dad at his house. So I don't know why, but I would say it wasn't bad necessarily. It was just neglectful in a way. It wasn't because they were so busy with their potential divorce and whatever caused that. I don't remember like a loving parent situation. It's more like, okay, just go in the other room or something like that's what it felt like.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't abuse or anything. It was just neglect.
Right. And it sounds like you had some health problems that had to be dealt with as well. And then how was your teenage year?
Well, and I don't know how I've talked to a lot of adoptees, and obviously all our stories are different, but I think one thing we share in common is we're disconnected from a lot of things. I don't know, were you adopted? I don't know. I'm now interviewing you. Are you an adoptee as well? I don't know. I didn't look that up. Okay.
I'm not an adoptee, but I'm an adoptive mother. And so, of course, I think about these things in connection with my children, for sure.
Okay, great. So there's a disconnection no matter how much I think. I've talked to many adoptees over the last couple, 10 decades, and the disconnection, sometimes it's a happy one, and sometimes it's not. And so I had this disconnection as I'm growing up where I felt like I was alone, despite the divorce. And in addition to the divorce, there we go, this word I'm looking for, in addition to the divorce. So it allowed me to have like an outsider's perspective. So growing up as a teenager, I was kind of a loner. I always say there's a difference between a nerd and a geek. A nerd is sort of like the guy who can't, or the person who can't interact socially. And a geek is more like the person that has ability to understand little high level stuff, and they tend to interact socially. So I don't know if I was a geek or a nerd, but I just know that I was kind of a loner at that time, and it's fine with me. I don't dislike my childhood. I think it went well, and I'm glad I had that outsider's view, and it helped me well in my writing career as well.
Now, you mentioned in Together More, Rejection and Reunion, that it was kind of this amnesia, and that's what you're referring to, that there's a lot of things you don't really remember. Until you were about the age of 50. So tell us a little bit about finding your biological family.
Well, I think in general, the word I was using there, it's an amnesia that all of us adoptees have. We have to fill in the gaps. We have to create our own new lives, especially if we have no idea about any of the past. We have no idea about our heritage or anything else. So we have an amnesia where we fill in the gaps with our own stories, however we want to make it. And sometimes even after you have a reunion, you continue living that story because that's all you've known. So when I realized who I really was, it really was dramatically changing. And I'm a non-emotional person for the most part. I was a data analyst most of my life, and you can't get any more dry than that, just crunching numbers. So when this emotional thing of finding your heritage and who you really are came to the fore, it was really dramatic, and had time to process that.
So you say that you kind of had made up your own story because you don't know. You don't know your biological, so you sort of made up your own story. And then how did you find your biological family?
Well, I'm from Indiana originally, and Indiana had pretty tight adoption laws. You couldn't really learn much about anything. I sent away for stuff, and even back when I was 18, all you got back was your mother's from Kentucky, something like that, and that's all you got. You didn't get how old she was or anything like that. But they changed the laws in about 2016 or 17, and I sent away for them again. And lo and behold, here comes back. If your parents are either deceased or they all agree to give you the information, you get them. So lo and behold, here comes back this letter. It doesn't only have her name, but it has, all this information as to where she was and who she is and everything else. And so in the internet age, I began, looking on Facebook and the internet, because I'm a data analyst, so data mining's my thing. And within 1 or 2 days, I had located through Facebook my nephew, one of my biological brother's sons. And then within hours, I located my half-sister, biological sister, and it just snowballed from there. It was amazing. So
Hmm. And that you mentioned that you had the story of who you were, and then now you find out really the truth about your biological family. How did those two stories contrast?
I missed part of that, but I think I get the gist of what you're asking here. So obviously my made up story in my mind was different than the reality. For one, when my birth sister first talked to me, she thought I was dead because they were told enough that I was left at the hospital and probably either died or was in a facility with either mental or physical or both problems. So I joke even to this day, I come back from the dead because they thought I was dead. And then my half biological sister said, "Hey, is Norma Renee with you?" Like, who's Norma Renee? It was another child who our biological mom gave up for adoption. I didn't know anything about that, obviously. And so that was shocking. I was like, who is this? And how she related to me. And this began another quest. So here I'm trying to fill in the pieces of all these biological siblings, half biological siblings I know. I'm also looking for this missing biological sibling that nobody knows where she went because they thought she went with me somewhere, but she did not. So I actually eventually had to hire what do they call those? And man, I can't think of the name suddenly. The investigators for adoptees. So they confidential intermediary. There we go. And so she, within less than a month, she found this biological missing sister.
And was she happy to be found? Tell me, how'd that go?
She was not happy to be found at first because when she was 18, she went looking and thought she found her biological family. Somehow this was before they could process DNA and things like that. And come to find out they were not, and they rejected her at some point and told her to go away and blah, blah, blah. So she thought that was done. She put it in her past and she was all done. So when the confidential intermediary first approached her, she almost didn't want anything to do with it. But then, fortunately, the confidential intermediary started giving her some of the names that are known, and those weren't any of the names that she previously had. So then she was curious and went further, and eventually we were connected together. So that was really interesting.
Was that healing for you?
It was. Here's the reason it was healing. I didn't know what to expect because I already had this affection for my half biological sister because she told me so much about my mother and got the story rolling and really began to shape us to who I really am. But what was different about this sister is we waited in yet another month because we had to get her DNA. We knew she was related to us, but how is she related to us? Because I have, from my birth family, I have the half-birth sister, the two older half-brothers, and another half-sister all the way from California from the paternal side. So we didn't know how this new sister fit in. Whose father is she? Well, come to find out, we were the only two given up for the adoption, and we're the only two that are 100% related. We have both the same father and mother, which made us the connection even stronger because of the shared experiences.
And you got to meet your father.
Yes, our father and our mother are the same, but both of them were deceased once I located them. Matter of fact, that biological father had died 1 year before I found all these people on my birthday. So
it's funny. I hear that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It is an interesting thing because I hear adoptees, they start to search and then they find them and they've just barely died. And so there's that feeling of regret. I should have started sooner.
I actually did, but there's just the tools and obviously the restrictions weren't there. Because a data analyst, and I've been on the internet before there was even pictures on the internet. It was all just, they call them BBSs. They were all part of the college text-based systems. And I began looking way back then, and and there were a lot of things that looked, like might be my match. That was the more frustrating because it sounded like, this might be my match, and it wasn't for decades before we finally got to this point.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Right. And so that's a frustrating thing.
Right,
So
because you swear it off after a while.
now,
I'm not going to search anymore, but then you go back and you search some more.
and that's sort of how your sister was, but she'd sworn it off totally until you guys showed up. Yeah.
Right.
And so how was it to meet your sister? You you guys hit it off pretty good?
Oddly enough, and, philosophically, politically, whatever you want to call it, culturally, her and I are most similar compared to all the other siblings, half-siblings. So it could have been completely different. I mean, we could have had completely different perspective and worldview, and it could have hindered things. But actually, it's strange because a lot of the things, even though we were completely raised differently by different parents and fairly the same region, because she was within 30 miles away from where I lived, but everything's more or less the same, our worldview. So I find that ironic.
And so you guys are now living near each other even now. Tell us a little bit about that.
Actually, so that's kind of dramatic and raw. I don't know if you read the entire book because there's some raw stuff in the book, but I wanted to be honest and get it all out there. So I just did. And it might not, some people think that's not a good idea, but I had to. That was part of the healing, so I did. And eventually as my constructed life, as I call it, wore down, my marriage and everything else, some other things, I eventually had really no other place to go. So her situation was perfect too, because she was not married at the time, and our kids were already grown and my kids were grown. So we're like, let's just hang out together. We got a lot of catching up to do anyhow. So eventually I moved down here to Florida, and we're living here together. So platonically, so obviously.
Yeah. And that was working out pretty good for you.
It's working out for us. Obviously, it's caused distress for other people because people don't understand what adoptees go through in general. It didn't matter whether it's a sister or a brother. I could have been living with a brother just as well, and it still would have caused issues because of the fact that, this isn't what they thought they were buying into, and then all of a sudden their life changes too. So they are probably affected by it more so than I am.
When you say they, who are you referring to?
My marriage family, my biological daughter, things like that. Anybody, my friends that were there, they just don't understand why didn't you stay in your previous life? Okay, well, because something changed. I can't explain it.
So what you're saying is that you had lived up to the age of 50. You had lived this life as an adoptee, as a part of an adopted family. You'd gotten married, you'd actually had children, and then when you met your biological family, it kind of shifted, and now you went into that life.
Right, because it was causing a rift. Even before I found the 100% sister I'm currently with, there was this pulling away and this jealousy, or what do you want to call it. And plus, even at my work, I couldn't concentrate anymore because I was thinking, well, how do I fit in? How does this work? And I wanted to spend more time with all my newfound family. Now, what will happen here, and I get this because I'm introspective this way. A lot of people say, well, you should have sought counseling, and then maybe they will help you work through it. I'm sorry, but I don't trust a lot of counselors because a lot of them, their lives, if you look at their lives, they usually don't tell you, their lives are sometimes more messed up than ours. So it's like, I'm not certain. I think I can work through it. Some people can't. I get it. I'm not saying that people should never go to counseling, but for me, I think I could. I did it the right way and try to help other people understand too. So.
And you did that primarily through writing. How has the writing affected how you've dealt with? You haven't gone to a counselor, dealt with some of these issues.
Well, it puts it down in hard ink, so therefore it's not just a hearsay. It's something that somebody can go back and look at and see if it's true. And it helps me make sure it's solid. It's not just something I'm thinking I'm here, but it's something I can document. So it's good for not just me, but for everybody else, hopefully. But again, sometimes things that are in print are harder to forget or gloss over, even for people who don't want it to be that way. So it's helpful and hurtful at the same time to different people.
This is very interesting because if you were to look at your biggest challenges as an adoptee, in some ways, it's you were this one person, you then meet your biological family, and you kind of shift into a different person and sort of leave who you were behind. Am I seeing that right?
Kind of, because the core of who I am is still the same. Because a lot of people who were told by some of my family that, hey, he's changed dramatically, he's completely different, you won't recognize him. So they wanted to see it for themselves, and they would call me and talk to me, and they say, well, besides the fact that he's away from you and he's got some new interest, he seemed to be at the core the same person. There's certain qualities that you never give up because that's who you are. And those, I think, are still there.
Do you think that that's typical for most adoptees?
I walk softly when people want me to talk for most adoptees. I know that's not what you're asking, but I did attend a few adoptee conferences earlier on, even before I found the sister here. And I noticed, at least, that the two that I've attended, a lot of the adoptees were bitter. They were bitter. They resented being adopted. They resent that they had to go the process. They resented that they were given up. They resented about the whole system. Why does adoption even exist? It's almost like they wanted either the government to force their biological parents to keep them no matter what. But I don't know how I relate to some adoptees if that's what most of them are. I don't know if they are. That's because I've only had 2 experiences with a large group of adoptees. But by nature, I'm not a bitter person. And by nature, I'm also what they call a determinist, which means I believe things happen for a reason. And so I'm always looking for the reason or the purpose of something rather than saying, oh, whoa, it's just a nihilistic thing that happened to me and I can't do anything about it. I usually, and that plays a part in a lot of my books. You'll see that if you ever read through any of them, there's this determinist philosophy all through, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. So
I think that's interesting because I've heard this philosophy of kind of what you said, that adoption should be banned and gotten rid of or altogether. And we know in the adoption community that's not really realistic. Otherwise, kids would end up in the foster care system or in situations that none of us would want them in. And yet there's an anger in many adoptees that they respond and say, well, this is so traumatic for me as an adoptee, it should never have happened. You do not see it that way.
No, and matter of fact, again, was growing up in adoptions in general, I wasn't an advocate for it. I was more personalized about what I was trying to find. But after I got through all this stuff, I started looking more about adoptees in general and the whole primal wound. I can't remember who the lady who wrote that, but I think if I recall right, she wasn't really adoptee or anything. So she speaks for adoptees and she's not an adoptee. And to me, what's happened is she's kind of given us this narrative, adoptees, this narrative that we're all wounded inside. We're constantly spending our whole lives trying to be unwounded. Yeah. Well, I don't see myself as wounded, even though I was given up for adoption and given up for dead, basically. So you can either dwell on that or you can say, well, there's a purpose in this. And maybe, like I said, some people, I'm not very a religious person. I wasn't raised religious, but I do believe there's purpose in things, especially since we see weird, unexplainable coincidences, if you want to call it that. I have a book called The Universe, which is about that very thing. Like we talked about how it seems like they find their birth parents at the moment they passed on. Just weird things like that continually happen in my life. And so I look at those things, and whether they're true or not, they help me move on. So there's a lot of adoptees that are stuck, I think, and it's not fair that they're stuck in the primal wound stage. Sometimes at age 60 and older.
Yeah. And you kind of feel for them. So if you were to sit down with them and you were actually to give them advice, what might you say to these adoptees that are feeling that way?
Well, again, I would have to know each individual's thing because there could be some dramatic or traumatic things that happen, and I don't want to gloss over those things. They're important to note. But even through all that, we have to carry on and develop who we are. And if they're constantly being defined by those things, they're never going to escape from that. Again, I could have been bitter. Look, I was left at the hospital. My mom didn't care about me. Oh, woe was me. I had all these birth defects, and then I was thrown into an adoptive family who got divorced 3 years later. And then basically, I don't tell it here, but in the book, I tell you about the adoptive mom who she basically neglected me and was not a very good mom after that. And the dad was a drunk and such. We could go on and on with all these sad sob stories, but that doesn't really help you move on in life. It helps you get stuck in life.
So that ability to move on, in part, you have done it through your writing. Other people may not be able to do it through their writing. What advice would you give them to kind of move on?
Well, I partly do it through the writing, but I also, in general, allow all the things I do, I believe they're interconnected. I have this theory or philosophy in life that everything's a process. Everything is everything. So whether I'm trying to learn how to bake cookies or launch missiles to Mars, it's still step 1, step 2, step 3. It's still processes. I guess that's the data analyst in me. So even when I'm out feeding my chickens or, gardening or growing exotic plants, that's all part of the same catharsis as the writing. So whatever your catharsis might be, you need to look for that and plug into it and use it to help advance you to the next stage.
Right. So now, as an adoptive mom, I, of course, worry about these things with my children. So what advice would you give adoptive parents in how they can help their children kind of address these woundedness and grow through them?
Well, obviously, we're at different stages of different things. So if you adopt a child very young, I think one thing you need to let them know fairly early their situation as much as you can, in as their level where they are. You don't want to go too high or too low. If you have an adult children, we're all going to go through different phases. I think it happens whether you're adopted or not, but with adoptees, it might even be more dramatic. So you might have raised your child and they loved you and you loved them and everything was wonderful and perfect. And somewhere down the line, somewhere in their adulthood, something clicks. Maybe they don't even find anybody, but something clicks in them. They feel like, I spent my whole life living this constructed life and I don't really know who I am. That could hit home at some point in their life. So you have to be ready for that as a adoptive parent, that could happen to you. So I don't know. And spouse of the adoptees too. I think it's dangerous when people get married. When people get married to adoptees, it's dangerous because they are really kind of living out a amnesia's life. So at any moment, something could click, even if they don't find their birth family, and they could change.
That's an interesting thought, that instability of that internal instability of adoptees could be problematic in relationships.
For sure.
How is your daughter doing?
She was having difficulties because my parenting style, along with my ex-wife, was to be as honest as you could, but also hide the undertones of lots of marriages where you have fights and things don't go right. So my daughter only seen 2 loving parents that were constantly always, had no problems at all. And so this kind of hit her like a ton of bricks. And she chose a side, which is not helping. And we're 5 or 7 years down the road now, and she's still having issues. I can't do anything about it. I'm trying, but if once you choose a side, it's hard to break through that. So I kind of just have to wait for her to come back to that. We still talk and everything else, but you could tell there's a wall there.
Well, fun.
There's challenges all around, aren't there? Challenges with biological children.
Yes, and it's overwhelming if you let it be, but you got to make sure it's not.
You have to keep moving along. You have to keep moving. Of all of the books that you've written, what book would you recommend, or books that you would recommend for people that are kind of struggling with their issues surrounding adoption?
Oddly enough, it was not the adoption book, because that's more of a personal story. Someday I may go back and write one that's more general to help adoptees. But again, I feel like that's almost assumptive of me to think I speak for all adoptees. So I'm kind of going slowly at that. So the one I really like and that helped me is the one that's called The Universe, because it helps say, how do I fit into the universe? No matter what you're religious or not religious or any of that stuff, it's not really about that. It's about how we fit in general as human beings and as individuals, because we're individuals and we're not, because whether you're adopted or not, you're plugged into some kind of tribe, if you want to call it that, and the tribe defines you. But every once in a while you say, who am I? And I think it happens more with adoptees than anybody else, because we really don't know who. So, like I said, for example, look at this. So I have really big lips. So when I was younger, I used to think, well, I might have a lot of African American in me. No problem, but I just thought I did. when I took the DNA test, I finally found out I do not. These big lips come from my Nordic or Viking heritage. They also have big lips, and so that's where they came from. So I didn't. There's lots of things you're not going to know about yourself ever. Sometimes, especially if you don't have any reunion, and so you just fill in the blanks, and sometimes that's not enough for people. That's what the book is for.
They want to know. There's this longing to know. Yeah, and regardless of what the biological parents are like, we're part of this larger universe. No, I can see that.
There's also traits. For example, my sister here, the 100% sister, she looks almost the spitting image of our biological mom. She has a lot of the same traits. Obviously, she wasn't raised with her. She wasn't raised by her. The way the family says, that's the way you flip your hair, the things you do. That's exactly what our mom used to do. Well, that's that culture or what they call nurture nature. That's part of the nature part of her that she can't change. And with the further back you go into your genealogy, the more you see, I'm like that. Or I'm like, for example, we found out her and I, our biological dad came directly from Germany in 1952. So I'm technically a second generation German, but I never would have thought that. So
yeah. How did that feel to find this out? Because you talk about you had this image in your mind of how things could be, maybe even partially African American, and then you find out a whole different story, and that I can see that might switch your internal belief of yourself.
Right. It made me feel smaller, but at the same time more connected to everything. Because, look, I'm just this one part. Because sometimes especially if you don't know who you are, you almost make yourself bigger than you are. I have the adopted sister, or actually the biological half sister, that was in California. She really had built a narrative. So when I interacted with her, she was struck. She didn't want to believe that we were even related, and she thought her dad that raised her was actually her biological dad. It was just very shocking for her. I think she still hadn't gotten over it. So it's careful. I think you have to be prepared. If you're going to actually try to go look for your birth family as an adoptee, you have to be prepared that it could not go well. I mean, there could be really wrong things. What if you were the product of rape, or you have to be prepared for all these things. If you're not, then maybe you shouldn't go poking where you shouldn't go, because you're not prepared, because it can really be really dangerous. So that's just some more stuff there.
Mm-hmm. Rodrik, would you like to, in closing, is there any advice or anything that you'd like to share with other people that are listening with the adoption view in mind?
Well, for the people who adopt children, especially younger children, try to tell them as soon as possible in their own levels, and build it up, and obviously love them like you're supposed to. To me, if you're going to adopt a children, you almost have to love it more than you would if it was your birth child, because of the fact they're always going to have that feeling like, do they really love me? Why did they choose me? I know sometimes adoptive parents will say, you're even more loved because I chose you, whereas a birth child sometimes just happens. Oops, So I know they've heard that before. But, for example, my biological sister, and I've cleared all the things I'm going to say with her, so she's not upset, but her parents, her adoptive parents, knew. They had the birth certificate somehow, so they knew her actual biological mother and father's name and never told her. Even during her search, when she found the fake family, they knew at that time that wasn't her real family. And to me, it would be hard for me to forgive that, but she has somehow, and she's moved on. So those kind of things need to be dealt with from the adoptive side. Now, as adoptees, again, you have to be prepared for, if you're going to go look, who you might really be. Or if you're never going to look, you have to be prepared for this. This is fine. I've created this person, and this is who I am. And to my dying day, that's fine too. So somehow you have to stabilize yourself in the universe.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, we all have to do that. But I think with that shifting sands underneath your feet, sometimes adoptees struggle with that just a little bit more. No, I appreciate that. Rodrik, thank you so much for all that you've shared with us. And I'm going to ask you again to please send pictures that we can share with the audience, and they can get a better feel for your story and also for the work.
I would love to, yes. Thank you for inviting me and seeking me out.
All right. Thank you very much. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Adoption. I'm Donna Pope. Every voice in the adoption triad deserves to be heard and understood. Visit voicesofadoption.org to subscribe and access our additional resources. And join us next time as we continue to build bridges through conversation.